our moderator today. Our moderator today, two panelists, and myself and IT support. So my name is Julia Hausmann. I'm the head of member benefits, and let's say we organized this fantastic webinar on this very, very hot item. So we have Tamara Thorpe, a very experienced moderator who will lead the conversation, and two experts on the matter, that's Farzana and Kelly. And of course, Steve Miller as IT support. So Tamara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julia, and welcome and congratulations on your new role with the SIETAR Europa Virtual Events Committee. Lots of work, and it is always wonderful to have Steve here to help us with the tech. And so thank you all for being here. I'm super excited to be here today with Farzana Nayani and Kelly McLeod-Shingen. I know many of you know us, but for those of you who are meeting us for the first time, I'll just say briefly that my name is Tamara Thorpe. I am the past president of SIETAR Europa and currently sit on the SIETAR Ireland board. I'm a past member of SIETAR USA and Young SIETAR. I am a organizational leadership and diversity, equity, inclusion consultant, trainer, and facilitator. And I sit in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I reside on the traditional homelands of the Sandia Pueblo and the Navajo and Apache nations. And so I want to thank them for their stewardship of the land and their contributions, both past and present, to the greater community. It is an absolute honor to be here today with two women who I consider friends, mentors, colleagues, and people who make the planet a lot better for being here and for the work that they do. So I will give a quick introduction on Farzana Nayani, who is originally from Canada, but based in Los Angeles. That was one of the first ways we connected, because when we met, I was living in Canada, but from Los Angeles. And so we had sort of switched lives and locations. And Farzana is a recognized diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist, coach, and keynote speaker. She has worked with Fortune 500 corporations, public agencies, higher education institutions, school districts, and nonprofit organizations as a consultant and trainer on diversity, equity, inclusion, intercultural communication, race, unconscious bias, and employee engagement. Farzana really specializes in working with employee resource groups, or what we call ERGs, and just 2 weeks ago released her newest book, The Power of Employee Resource Groups and How People Create Authentic Change. So congratulations, Farzana. Farzana has also published 2 great books on raising biracial and multiracial children. And so that is a place and space where she holds a lot of expertise, and not only speaking from her own experience as somebody who identifies as multi-ethnic with a Filipinx and Pakistani background, but also who is raising children with a multicultural background in a multicultural environment. So super excited for Farzana to be here, as well as Kelly McLeod-Shingen, who many of you, as I said, also know, who brings an extensive and stellar background and record in diversity inclusion expertise, specializing in storytelling and healing from racism. I know many of us have learned from Kelly about storytelling and healing from racism in her powerful workshops that she has done within SIETAR network and outside. She is past president of SIETAR USA and the founder and artistic director of World Stage, which is a global theater company that is doing incredible storytelling and social justice work through performance and theater, and is also now doing some incredible work at the University of Tulsa. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So I could not say more about these two, but I'm just grateful that they are here. And it was actually almost 2 years ago to the date that we met to kick off the anti-racism learning series within SIETAR Europa. I want to mention that when we had that conversation in July of 2020, that there were two other people with us as part of that conversation. So first, I want to recognize Josephine Apraku, who is from Germany and a former member of SIETAR Europa and Young SIETAR, who was a part of our conversation and shared with us her experience in anti-discrimination work. And then we also had a member with us from Julia Walgren, who is originally from Brazil, but living in Europe, who is a member and still works at the European Network Against Racism. Neither of them were able to join us today, but we want to just speak and make note that they continue to do the work that they are doing. The work that they do within the European context is important. And if you are not familiar with the European Network Against Racism, I encourage you to visit their website. They do incredible work in collecting data within the European context around the impact of race and racism on racialized and ethnic minority communities in European context, which is really, really valuable and important because there are many parts within Europe where that data cannot be and is not collected. So with that context, I also want to say that we have some community guidelines for having this conversation. Steve's going to put those into the chat. And so we want today to be as engaging as possible. We don't have as much time as we had last time. We have an hour together today. We want to encourage everyone to be curious. We want to encourage everyone to ask questions. We want to encourage you all to share your own knowledge, wisdom, and experience in the chat as well. So if you have questions for myself, Kelly, and Farzana, please put those into the Q&A box, and I will be tracking questions that come in to the Q&A box. If you are just sharing and engaging in the chat, that's fantastic. Please go ahead and do that. But if you have questions specifically for us, go ahead and put those into the Q&A. We'll keep track of the conversations that happen in the chat, but y'all chat a lot and move quickly, so we may not capture it all. So with all that being said, I want to open the table. We're going to have this be as much of a roundtable discussion as possible. When we last met in this space, Kelly and Farzana, we were in the earliest stages of the global uprising that we saw in response to the murder of George Floyd and the growing and surge in the BLM movement. Since then, we have been doing a lot of work and we've seen a lot of changes. And so I would love to hear from the two of you, right? Since our last conversation, what have you been doing? What have you been seeing in terms of advancement with the work we're doing around anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what's different?
You want to go first, Farzana?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's so nice to be here again, and I can't believe 2 years has passed. It is something for us to pause and reflect, so I'm grateful for the space and for being hosted in this way by SIETAR Europa and both of you. Part of what I've been noticing is a couple of things. One is that if we can all remember during that tragic murder and actually not just of George Floyd, but of many Black lives and, you know, the uptick in anti-Asian racism, which we'll talk about, what we saw was this frenzy. It was, you know, absolutely chaotic at the time, with people reaching out, looking for what to do, people making donations. And there is a reckoning. There was a racial reckoning, and there still is. But what I'm seeing, you know, from now to then has been, you know, some sustainable initiatives that have been put into place. Previously, I have been engaged with, doing surveys and assessments and having dialogue sessions and making sure people feel okay. And we focused a lot on healing and making sure there is community space holding. And that still continues and is needed. But I think what we've done is weathered that really urgent need. And even though the need is still urgent, what we're doing right now is seeing in the consulting work that I do, an emphasis on, for example, coaching and having deeper conversations and that personal development in addition to an organizational strategic effort. So I think those two things need to happen hand in hand. There has to be that organizational push and that rise, and also the personal development and that learning journey. But, the silver lining in all of that is there are people who've been wanting to do DEI work at organizations and anti-racism work, but just didn't have the momentum behind it. But with the world being more awakened to it, it unleashed all of that. So there was really no going back. And, as practitioners in the field and people who are doing this work, we're on the front lines, and it's nice to come together and know that we're not alone, because we are moving through a lot individually at many times.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today to continue this important conversation. The thing that I was most worried about was that 2 years later, would there be anyone who was coming to the conversation? Because everyone wanted to talk about it in 2020. And then as things tend to happen, I thought that people would start falling off. The good news is that the trend has continued, which is really very exciting. And I've been really happy to see that there's been an increase in people going for DEI certifications. There's been an increase in people wanting to become anti-racist facilitators. There's been an increase in people wanting to really be able to equip themselves to be able to have a deep and thoughtful and transformational conversation around issues of race and racism. I have to be the Debbie Downer a little bit as well, because I have also found that in the influx of so many new professionals doing this work is that it feels for me many times that I am then called back in order to clean up the mess that had been made, because so many young professionals are still so angry, are still so frustrated by the fact that this isn't moving fast enough, that they have kind of swung the pendulum back in the work to blame and shame. And finger wagging. And, in my practice specifically, I worked for, 20 plus years to move away from that approach. So the fact that so many are beginning to practice it again is really disheartening, because I think that it will throw us back. I think that there's the other thing that I'm really incredibly encouraged by is that there is the continued increase in the ability to even say racism in the workplace, to say that we are addressing issues of race and racism in the workplace. Early on, you couldn't say it. You had to say everything but diversity, inclusion, ethnic relations, interethnic relations, intercultural relations, but you couldn't say racism. And frankly, my mentor would say, once we can get that right, then we can get everything else right. It becomes easier because that's one of the hardest conversations, if not the hardest conversation to have globally. The other thing that I've been really excited about is that there's been an increase in the willingness to have a conversation about the fact that we need mental health support and to take care of our own mental health. There were times during the last 2 years where I've had to walk away from the work for my own mental health, because I needed to gather myself. If I'm not healthy, then I can't help others with this conversation. So it was really important for me to try to find some support so that I can center myself again, because it was really easy to get out of whack for so many reasons. And I think that the other part about all of this is that it's been really exciting to see that there's so many different organizations that want to have the conversation and be willing to call it racism, still saying that. The challenge However, is that some organizations wanted to jump into the deep end. They wanted to go straight to figuring out how to be more inclusive, to increase their numbers, to, you know, of underrepresented populations and targeted and racialized minorities, right? But what they didn't do was to do the assessments to figure out where they needed to begin. And some people needed to take really very beginning baby steps instead of jumping straight into the deep end, because then it shut down a lot of people. And what we're seeing now is the result of that through this great replacement theory, right? And so we can talk a little bit more about that, but I think that, you know, I posted on LinkedIn recently that I believe that that is the greatest threat to the work that we're doing. If we cannot give whiteness a place to go, then we are going to constantly receive the level of pushback that we're receiving legislatively and politically worldwide. And then I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kelly, for that. And Farzana, because I think my experience, right, is, yeah, right, that immediate sense of urgency created a lot of frenzy, a lot of chaos for practitioners, especially in terms of how can we respond to this really increased demand, not only from clients, but other practitioners wanting to move into the space and help and use the skill sets that they had to move into that space. And so we have seen, right, growing opportunities for people, for practitioners to upskill, to move into the space. But I think, you know, Kelly, you know, what you said is that we do have practitioners who still have a really strong sense of urgency of like, we need to do more faster and quicker. And right, as facilitators, as educators, as trainers, we know that you kind of have to meet people where they're at, right? And if you don't meet folks where they're at, you're going to lose them. And certainly that has been my experience of recognizing where people are at and how do we meet them where they're at to move them further along, right? And I think what you brought up, Kelly, is certainly two things you brought up. We all, right, can look at the word race and we can look at the system of race and know that it's a social construct, but it is so important that we recognize that despite that, those things being true, racism is real, it's global, and it impacts people in really profound ways. And one of those ways being mental health, right? You know, I'm currently working with some educators who are working with, you know, students. I'm doing a lot of work with educators and really trying to center their anti-racism work in mental health, because when children are experiencing racism, it has an entire impact on their development, their sense of self, their engagement in learning. And so whether it's from how people experience racism and the impact on their mental health, which you've, Kelly, helped me understand a lot, but and balancing that with our own mental health as practitioners. But for me, right, the inability to speak about racism has impacted me in very deep emotional ways. And so now that we can say it, name it, and center it in improving everyone's mental health, for me has been a very critical tipping point in my ability to do the work.
I agree with that. Tamara, before you go to the next question, the other thing that I'll say is that, you know, not only does racism, the researchers in the medical industry are discovering, is that not only did it impact us in our mental health, but our physical health, which is why some communities suffer from certain diseases more so than others do. You know, there's this notion of racism being a dis-ease, right? It makes us uncomfortable. It makes us, you know, we're not at ease with it, right? And so when you think about it, you know, disease is exactly that, right? So I think that the more that we can realize that when our society isn't healthy, right, that impacts everyone's mental and physical health, and we need to be mindful of it.
Yeah. Farzana?
Well, and yeah, I can add, I mean, there are numbers that show that. So disproportionately, the communities that were ravaged by COVID-19 in this order were the Black community, the Native community, and actually the Pacific Islander community. And that the third stat might surprise you, but there has been historically what Kelly's making a point of for all three of those communities, oppression, systemic oppression, a lack of care, healthcare, nutrition, and compounding all of that is the onset of long-term illness and disease and degenerative conditions. It isn't, and then adding bias to that, right? So when folks do show up for medical care, they're turned away, or it's not as bad, or there's a sense of privilege given to other people. So not only is racism a disease in the sense of that as an illness, but we're dying from it. We're literally seeing loss of life, and the grief that our communities feel compounds that even more. So, when we're talking about mental health awareness, May was Mental Health Awareness Month. It also was Asian Pacific Islander Awareness Month, Heritage Month. And I really resented having to talk about mental health and not bringing up my Asian Pacific Islander background. Like, that's the intersectionality that we need in this work. You can't talk about one thing and not about the other. And when any of us is asked to speak or hold space or facilitate, or when you're working with employees or colleagues who might have, a sense of this experience of multiple identities, or even, that of race as being a main part of their identity in addition to gender or any other aspect, we really need to take into account, what that means. So I encourage us all to think about that in our practice, in our intercultural work, and how that plays out.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because I think that that's important, right? Because I do want to talk about one, right, that we saw very similar stats in the UK and Europe as it related to COVID-19 and its impact on BAME communities, right? And so that intersectional conversation is really critical. And then when we look at that connection between past and present, right, that particularly in the US context, there's a long-standing legacy of placing blame on Asian communities for disease, for all sorts of social ills. And so when we had COVID-19 being connected to, right, China and Chinese people, and that impact, right, that impact that it has had, particularly in Europe and the US, for anti-Asian hate, racism, and violence, it's profound, right? And so we can never look at anything in isolation. So my question for you, Farzana, is, right, where are we now around what is happening for the AAPI community, particularly in the US context and globally? How important is the conversation then around intersectionality and allyship?
Yeah, I appreciate being able to talk about it, especially with this audience, because there are a couple of elements of nuance that I think people don't really understand. One is that, as we know, each community in each cultural context has different cues: verbal, nonverbal, direct, indirect communication, high context, low context. And I think what people think about the Asian Pacific Islander community is, oh, we're not hearing anything about it, they must be okay. And that's a flaw. That's a flaw in thinking. If you were to do business or interact with anybody from the Asian Pacific Islander community, you'll know that as a community, we tend to be indirect. We tend to, right, move to the collective and lean on the collective. So when the collective is not there for us, we're missing something. And in the individualistic societies that we've had to migrate to due to, right, our groups, our communities being displaced or having to be overseas labor, the communities that we've moved into to help or to find freedom in have not been there to support in the way that we know from our cultural standpoint. And that has been compounded also with the model minority myth and people looking at Asians and thinking they're all great at math and they're all good at science and et cetera, and it being made to be a farce. This identity is now a big meme. And that has been, you know, contrived by the media over time, and the American dream, and how the model minority is now actually pitted against other minority groups, and how we are seen as a wedge. And I myself identify as a woman of color to create that unity amongst all the groups and to bridge. And I'm absolutely in favor of the movement for Black Lives and anything to do with Native and Latinx community groups and their solidarity and their healing and their rights. But what we need also is advocacy and action, and what you're saying, allyship for the Asian Pacific Islander community. We've had a horrible time. This is also the anniversary of the Atlanta shooting, you know, a year ago, where there was a number of Asian women who died. There was a few recently that actually were with the Asian community, and unfortunately, we're not getting enough attention. The silver lining, though, is what I'm seeing as a positive is there is more attention than before from an organizational standpoint. The employees in the different companies that I've worked with and seen have mobilized and are starting employee resource groups. And believe it or not, there are about 50 or 100 that got started in the past 2 years. That is incredible. However, that also means that they weren't there before. So I am going to say that that is a problem, because it means that that wasn't there before. But we will, you know, move forward in progress. But that all being said, I think we've got to eradicate things like our political officials calling it the Chinese virus, or people jokingly calling it the Kung flu. Like, that doesn't help the situation. There are humans behind this, and there are over 10,000 acts of violence reported in the United States alone, of assault, violence, harassment, discrimination against the Asian Pacific Islander community. And that's just what was reported. So, you know, I appreciate everyone understanding that just because how we approach advocacy might look a little different, it definitely is intercultural. And I don't think that in society we have an intercultural lens on this type of advocacy, which I think we really need.
Kelly, are you looking for your mute button?
Well, I wasn't sure that I could, you know, offer much more than that. I think that I can say some of the things that we did at the university in order to address the anti-Asian violence that was going on at that time was, you know, we didn't want to, my assistant director, or the assistant VP for diversity, equity, and inclusion at the university, she's also African-American. So we didn't want to speak for that community, right? But what we did want to do was to make sure that we partnered with many individuals from the Asian American community who were planning things like vigils and rallies and creating different types of marches on the city. And many of our students were at the center of that. And most of them had never done anything like this before. So what we wanted to do was to partner them with other students within, you know, the African-American student population had been protest and march and, you know, letting their voices be heard for, you know, eons, really, right? But so the African-American student organization worked with our Asian American student organization in order to help them plan their march. And so what I loved about it was that it was a multicultural approach to it, the representation that showed up from all of the communities who have been targeted, and coming away with some very specific things that people could do within their organizations in order to address it. You know, so the myriad of things, the standards that, you know, came out was that you need to make a, you know, a statement and make sure that that statement is backed by action, right? You need to be able to foster and create levels of training so that people understand what microaggressions look like. Because that's kind of how it was showing up across the campus specifically, was in microaggressions, but throughout the city, it was really very violent, figuring out ways to how to report to the police department when things happened, or to campus police throughout the city again. So so one of the most important things that we did was to get out of our own way, to not assume that we knew what all of the issues were, to not take up space in that conversation, even though the experiences may have been felt in the same way. The way that they play themselves out specifically for the Asian American community is different from the African American community. And so all of the speakers were members of the Asian American community. And we just supported them, right? Gave them the help they needed, and then got out of the way.
You know, I love hearing that, and it's so appreciated. And to add to the European context, I don't know if people know this, but there was a high incidence of Filipina nurses in the UK contracting COVID-19 because they were the ones tending to patients. And if you look at the stats on this, it was a high propensity in the Asian community, but when you trace it back, that's where the source was. So the irony here, right, is that people think that Asian people carry the virus, but we're the ones who are also helping to continue the care. And I think when sometimes we have these conversations, we base it in the US context and we say it doesn't happen here where I live in Europe or elsewhere. But there is that. I've even heard of it in, parts of India where people were racist against East Asian people because of how they look and their Nepali colleagues and neighbors, because they could be mistaken for being Chinese, etc. And at the height of the virus, that was the narrative. So I want us to really push through also that this is a North American issue. We are also seeing it in Canada, so my homeland where I was born and grew up. There have been a lot of incidents against that, and the intercultural context there is a lot of people tend to want to be polite and tend to not be bystanders and intervene. So I think that there's an intercultural lens on everything that this involves, and I'm grateful for us to talk about it today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate both of you sharing and reflecting, right? Because 2 years ago, we were in a very different place, and we have seen lots of folks doing a lot of work, right? Whether it's in our work as practitioners and upskilling and how we're supporting organizations. And I know that I've had the opportunity to see organizations that are trying to come up with some more sustainable efforts. But also, right, as a community of practitioners within the SIETAR network, there is still a lot of work on how we have these conversations on how we have these conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, anti-racism, and interculturalism, right? There's these intersections that are really critical. And as we think about the work that we all do, one, I think absolutely we are all people are tuned in to these topics, but not everybody knows what to do or how to respond, right? And so I appreciate you, Kelly, giving us some really great examples of how we can align and be allies. And part of that is connecting with people who know better than we do, right? Sometimes as practitioners, we feel like we have to know everything, but we know that it's impossible, right? To know everything about every community. That's why very often we rely on our colleagues who are experts around other cultural communities that we're less familiar with to help us fill in the gaps. And so there are so many opportunities here when we think about what we don't know, is to think about then who does know, and how can we partner, how can we educate ourselves, how can we rely on those who do know better to give space for them to have the conversations and to lead the conversations. And I think many of us were just at the Congress in Malta, the SIETAR Europa Congress in Malta. And I talked about that, one of the things I said when I had an opportunity to say something was that sometimes part of doing this work is not centering ourselves in the work, right? We have a tendency to put ourselves as the experts in the middle of the conversation, and sometimes a way in which we can best be allies is to not center ourselves in the conversation. So I want to talk about this intersectionality, right? Why is anti-racism work important? How is it different from diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then what is the role of the work we do as intercultural researchers and practitioners in anti-racism and DE&IB work?
So that's a really big question, Tamara. I'm going to see if I could take it in pieces. Right. So I think that anti-racism work is different from DEI work, specifically because it is focusing in on one of the areas of identity that is has been targeted in the work of inclusion, right? So, and one of those areas is race. And I think that, like I said before, I think it's been one of the hardest, because I don't know any part of the world that hasn't been really tapped in some way, either being conquered, colonized, or enslaved. Or pillaged and plundered and raped for its goodies, right? Or isolated and not been engaged with because of that, right? So, I mean, I feel strongly, and this is me getting on my political, platform and whatnot, but I feel strongly that the main reason why Haiti is struggling economically and in that community is because they were the only successful slave revolt in the entire country, in the world, right? They were the only ones who successfully revolted, got the folks out, and was like, you don't get to come back. Well, folks got upset about that and said, okay, well, then you're screwed forever. And so that's a real thing. And even the way that it shows up between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, right? I mean, there's that what some would call horizontal racism or internalized racism from one marginalized or oppressed community to another. So I think that's focusing in on racism and being mindful that it does show up in every environment. And as people become more migratory, is that a word? Did I make that up? As people migrate more throughout the globe, but we become more mobile, issues of race and racism will constantly show up in whatever way it shows up, right? And so I think that is going to be a challenge, and one that I believe that interculturalists need to be mindful of, right? A lot of times, I used to get frustrated with the work of placement with interculturalists doing that, pre-departure training for cultures and communities or leaders that were going into another part of the world, but they wouldn't talk about some of the social issues that were at hand. And many of the people who were the frontline employees tend to be those people who come from those marginalized or underrepresented communities in the workplace. And if you don't know the history of that, if you don't know the history of how they came to reside, at the so-called bottom of the hierarchy, then you're setting yourself up for failure. And I think that it needed to be a responsibility of interculturalists in order to do that. I think that the DEI generally is about visiting the conversations of power, and the way that power has impacted all of the targeted communities, whether they are, gender, sexual orientation, race or religion, or, whatever, right? So the targeted communities, those that have systemically and historically been prohibited and prevented from access to opportunity and advancement. So I don't know if that answered all of the questions. It was a big one, but at least that was what was on my heart.
Thanks, Kelly. It's thank you for that distinction, right? I think that distinction between anti-racism work and DE and IB work is really helpful. Farzana, what did you want to add?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of components around intercultural research that could be looked at. So who are our participants in our studies? Who's reviewing the work that we get to put a stamp on and publish. Are there voices of color involved in any of that? As we've seen with medical trials, there have been people who haven't, partaken in them because of oppression from, the government in the past that have conducted trials on people without their consent. And so now what you're seeing with any type of study is a reluctance from communities of color to participate. So what are we doing to build those bridges to make sure that, number one, folks are included, and number two, that the format and the practice of the research actually involves people that aren't usually at the table or within arm's reach due to our own bias of affinity or with the circles we're in. So that's one. I think another one has to do with, I'm so glad Kelly touched upon it, those relocation trainings. Those relocation trainings, which at some point we've all done, right? We've all conducted those because we're all experts in various cultures. Are we actually interrogating the sources of power, the systems at hand? Are we talking about colorism, that if you're light skinned, you'll have more privilege. If you're dark skinned, you won't. And I think as interculturalists, a lot of the time we want to look at the common values and that iceberg and, what's beneath it all. And that's great, but there is a reality in that I'm going to be treated differently than Kelly is, or Tamara is, or, Joe down the street. And that's just the reality. So when we sweep that under the rug and we say, look, we're starting fresh and you're in a new role, or, you're going to make a new life here. It really dismisses all of that. It dismisses the indigenous folks that were in there and whose land got occupied. And I really wish we could have some conscious conversations. Yes, they're uncomfortable, they're painful, they're hard. We are contributing to that as settlers on the lands that we're on. Can we bring some righteousness and equity to it? Can we bring some availability of looking at, people who don't have the voice or privilege that we have? And I think we can do that. I think that there's the ability we can at any point, and teaching our children to also relocate with us about that and the consciousness around it. So I am hopeful, but I think it's up to us to take the miniature steps at each point, and also the harder ones, and say to companies, you know what, you're missing something here. I really think we should talk about X, Y, and Z or Z. So the opportunities are here, but are we ready to? Are we okay with bringing that up? Are we available to hold space for that? Pushback, backlash as allies. So I think it's worth a conversation, and I think that's where we're in right now. 2 years later, is what are we doing too?
Yeah, I very much feel like we're in the middle of the conversation, right? It is right. I think 2 years later, we are in the middle of the conversation, which is in part, how do we as individuals feel better equipped to have the difficult conversations? And how are we helping clients? I know that 2 years ago, a lot of requests came in from, at least to me, from companies that have been better known for their relocation work, and looking at what needs to change and how we train our leaders to relocate, because when they relocate, they are leading talent whose identity is very much tied to being marginalized, being oppressed, experiencing racism. And when leaders come from other parts of the world, or even within their own country, and don't have an experience, don't have a sense of what that experience is from, that's really, it doesn't equip them to be able to successfully lead a multinational, multicultural team. So that I know a lot of work that I have done, particularly in the last year, or actually the last 3 months, is working with leaders who come from outside the US, who are leading US teams, who don't have any historical context for what they see happening in their everyday environment. And being able to give people historical context has been very profound, right? People who I've seen, people from Europe who are living and working in the US, who, after learning more about the historical context say, oh, well, now this makes more sense. They come into the training going, why do Americans talk about race all the time, right? why is it, why are Black lives more important than other lives? But understanding, right, that historical context has been really profound. And I think that that is something that when I think about the work that I have done as somebody who does intercultural work, is recognizing what is missing, right, in our intercultural work, that is cultural information that is going to help people be better in that context, right? And I think that a lot of that has historically been missing in intercultural work. So that leaves with this question: what can intercultural practitioners do to expand and develop their work to be, one, more anti-racist, and to support diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging?
I'll say start with yourself. I think that as interculturalists or as DEI practitioners, your greatest tool is yourself. And as I said before, if you're not healthy, then you're not going to be able to help other people be healthy. And so I think that first, holding up the mirror, it's going to be uncomfortable for a while, just trying to figure out, in what ways have you, potentially perpetuated certain issues, and what are your gaps, right? Finding out what that is. What do you need to know about yourself, how you show up in spaces, how your desire to always want to jump straight to solutions, right? Without hearing the impact of how the very thing that we're talking about is preventing people from being able to speak up. So if they don't have an opportunity to speak up, and you want to jump straight to the solutions, then what solutions are you going to be able to come to, right? I mean, they're going to simply be Band-Aids on situations, because people will be like, well, you weren't listening to me anyway, so whatever, right? And it may make you feel good because, well, we did it, we created this policy, we made this statement, right? Because you ticked the list off. If you're so focused on ticking things off the list, then you're not doing the important work. Some of it is just sitting in the discomfort of being in dialogue with people whose experiences are different from your own, and just freaking listen. It's one of the hardest things to do. For so many years, I talked about storytelling. I started doing storytelling, intentionally in 2001. Many of you have seen my stories that I've told over the years. Over the last, I want to say probably 7 years, I've been talking more specifically about story listening, being better listeners to people's experiences. And what can you take from that? What do you learn? What do you learn about them? What do you learn about yourself? So the first thing I would say for interculturalists is to move away from identifying yourself as an expert. And the reason why I say that is because I don't know that there is a such thing. First of all, that's in my humble opinion. I don't know that there is a such thing. And specifically with regards to race and racism, I think that if you become an expert, then you never make mistakes and you always get it right. I think that you're an expert in yourself, and we can get better at knowing more about ourselves so that we can utilize ourselves better as that tool. So there you go.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better. I think modeling vulnerability is a big one. So in addition to listening, acknowledging when we don't know something and our efforts to learn. I think, understanding what triggers us and where we have our own resistance is big. It can really be a blocker for any of the listening that, we're talking about, or really understanding a deeper story. In my other book, which Tamara mentioned, Raising Multiracial Children, I have a tool called the Racial Dialogue Readiness Questionnaire, and it's designed to help parents, get ready to talk to their kids about race. But I think we as humanity should all take a moment and pause and take stock of, where are our biases? Have we had trauma? Are we prepared to deal with a topic or not? And I think that when we think about racism or anti-racism, we automatically have emotions around that. We automatically have maybe the feeling like we need to kind of explain, like this is why I said that, and maybe we're defensive, and that's natural. However, what can happen is we're bringing that into the room, right? Versus holding space for what the conversation is that is needed. So I encourage us all to kind of go through that and think about, what do I need? And I can see some of the comments in the chat around, are we ready? Are we ready as interculturalists? And if we're not in some areas, that's okay. We have a ton of skills though. We have a ton of skills to build on. And so we leverage that, work on that, and at the same time grow in another area. So I think all of that can happen at the same time. It's a both and, as always. And these conversations are amazing to help, surface that in our community.
Thanks, Farzana, for that. I think that's a really important piece, right? That not all of us as practitioners are going to hold space for these conversations. And we know that these conversations are nuanced and can and may need to happen differently in different parts of the world and different parts of Europe. And there's a comment from Annika who shared, and I just want to again direct Annika to the European Network Against Racism and their reports and the research that they did, and the language and terminology they use around racialized communities and the experiences of ethnic minorities within the European context, I think is important. And as somebody who does work with multinational companies where we are trying to support this conversation happening globally, a key part of that is exactly what Farzana said, is listening, right? As we listen to different communities and different clients around the world, listening for what those needs are and what are unique and what are common are a key part of how we find solutions. But because we very often think we have the answers, or we think if we just get the to-do list that, we'll be fine, give us the top 5 things to do or not to do, right? We all know that as interculturalists, right? People come and just when we go to that country, tell us what not to do and what to do. But that's not always going to be the case, right? We have to do the work at a deeper level, right? It is really being able to have that conversation at a deeper level, which does require listening. And very often, as Kelly said, sitting in the discomfort of listening, because we are so used to talking that it can be very difficult to sit and listen. And know that very often the solution we're looking for is in the experience of listening. That very often it may not be explicit, but the solutions are in the story. And I think that is a key part, right? And so I know, as somebody who has lived in different parts of the world, facilitates this conversation happening globally, there is nuance, absolutely. But at the core of what we're talking about is very much the same, right? And that really is, I think, what is, for me, important for folks to take away. So for you, Farzana and Kelly, based upon our conversation today, as we wrap up these next couple minutes, what is important for you, for this audience of SIETArians and intercultural practitioners and DEI folks who are here and folks here who do anti-racism? What do you want to be the key takeaway from our conversation today?
I'll make it really quick. I think that each individual needs to go back to either the country that they're living in currently or the country that they are from, if you're still in that same place, and start unpacking oppression and the way that oppression has showed up in the country, how it showed up in legislature, and the people who were targeted by it. Once you can begin to know that history, then you can see how the past is never past. The past is equally as present. And so I think the first going back, reaching back, trying to figure out and explain some of the issues with immigration, the people who have been targeted around immigration. You know, it might be worth it for the French to look at their anti-Muslim practices. Where does that come from? Why? What's the history of that? Finding out what that is, communicating to the people, going back to the beginnings of legislation and who started it is one of the most important ways to begin to understand the depths of this and how it is built into the fiber of our societies.
I want to add to what Kelly said, and I think the other source of information are the community organizers and organizations that are in the communities you're already in. This is not a new conversation. We are not the source of this conversation. It didn't start in the US, it didn't start in Canada, it didn't start in Europe. It's everywhere we live. And there are people that are actually already doing the work around this. So the goal for us is to reorient ourselves to listening to those groups and communities and understanding what their needs are and putting those first, rather than maybe our lack of awareness or our orientation to getting our work done. Ultimately, what we're here to do is create equity and belonging in society. We're vehicles for that, and there is a sense of humility we need. So I say that being a settler on the lands that I'm on, and also having immigrant family members and parents from colonized countries. And that ancestry is something I carry with me. So it's an expansive view to really look at the source of where we come from, where our ancestors have come from, what we've contributed to either creating the situation we're in or helping resolve parts of it. So that's something I think we all can also add to our personal journey.
Thank you both. I appreciate you all coming back 2 years later to talk about where we are, how far we have come, and where we need to continue to go. As I read through the chat, we have a really incredible, knowledgeable community. People who are passionate about learning more, people who are passionate about sharing. Joe has said, when are we going to have these conversations face to face? I think as we look at SIETAR community and how we continue to have these conversations virtually and in person is key to our ongoing development and growth as a community of practitioners. So thank you to SIETAR Europa and to Yulia for creating the space for us to have this conversation. And thank you to everyone for being here.
Thank you to the three of you, Fasana, Kelly, Tamara. It was a fantastic conversation. And as I said at the beginning of this discussion, it is an ongoing discussion, and there is hunger for more. Face to face, absolutely, that would be fantastic. Difficult to organize, but not impossible. Nothing is impossible, isn't it? Eh? If you believe if there is a will, there is a way. So let's not wait 2 more years to get together again, whether it is virtually or face to face. And as the three of you mentioned, we are not done here, are we? There is always something new to say about it. And the knowledge has to be transmitted to the young Italians as well, to the new generations as well. We might not, fix the world, but we could try, right? So thank you so much to everybody. This recording will be placed on YouTube. And please keep an eye on our next webinars and blogs and articles to all Cietarians, non-Cietarians, interculturalists, and beyond. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Papa.